This video is for BTEC Sport and Exercise Science and Unit 6 Coaching for Performance and Fitness. And specifically it's the last video relating to Learning Aim A, A5 Technology and Sports Professionals. So this is what things can coaches use to support their coaching and hopefully support their athletes. And it's kind of in two halves: what technological things can be used and what other specialist professionals can be used to support the coach and the athletes. Here's the spec listing several possible things that you could include, and that's the technology side, of course. These are the sports professionals that could be used, and importantly, just note the bottom bullet point on each side. Not only have you got to explore and analyse the role of these other technologies and professionals, but you've got to consider how effective they are, the cost, the practicality, how usable they are, and relevance to the coach and the athletes. And the same applies to the professionals. Just to remind you, this assignment requires you to describe. So this down here is the P2 criteria: describe the role of technology and professionals in supporting athletes and coaching. Explain and analyse the role. So you've got to have some kind of critical approach to them rather than just assuming they're all good. There may be some negative consequences, there may be some limiting factors of their use, and explain through a range of sporting examples as always. So let's start by thinking about technologies that coaches might use within their sport and how. So what examples are there? Perhaps think about your own sport or other sports where you know there are technologies. What can it be used for? So there are different reasons technology might be used. There might be different outcomes or information given, different ways they might support the coaching process. What are those benefits, and what issues might there be associated with the use of these technologies? These are the ones that are listed by the specification as possible things to consider. Now, I'm not going to ask you necessarily to explore in detail all of them. You might mention most of them, but you need to look in detail at a good range. And I suggest you think carefully about what ones you feel confident to be able to analyse the use of. Remember, there are those criteria. This is what you need to consider when you're analysing the technology that you choose. How effective is it? What evidence do you have of that effectiveness? What data does it give the athlete or the coach? How expensive is it? How practical is it to use? Is it highly complex or really simple and straightforward? Is it a big bit of equipment, or is it something you wear on your wrist? How readily available is it? Is it something you can only get in labs, or is it something you can wear daily? And again, how simple is it to use for the athlete, or is it quite intrusive or complicated or technological? Will the athlete themselves understand the data you get, or do you need a sports scientist or a coach to translate it for you? And just how relevant is it to the coach? What's the real purpose behind using it? Sometimes I think we can get wrapped up in using technologies just because they're there, or it's a fad. I would suggest you consider maybe preparing this section in tabular form. So for each of the technologies, here are the criteria I've just mentioned, and maybe note some positives and negatives associated with each. So what is the thing that you're looking at? Who might use it? And then think about these criteria both in a positive context and is the cost a positive thing because it's cheap, or is it a negative thing because it's really expensive and might limit who can access and use it? Let's look very quickly at these. I'm not going to go through every single aspect of every single technology, but I'm going to give you a snapshot of each of them and a starting point for your own thoughts. You, of course, need to come up with your own conclusions, your own analysis, and put everything into your own words. So, video analysis software, really, really commonly used. So this is slow-mo. It's basically a lot of cameras now will do slow motion, enables you to watch back if you video a performance in slow motion and pick out and give you time to pick out more details in terms of the performance. Coach's Eye can be free, or you can pay for a subscription which gives you more usability. Dartfish is a software program which is much more expensive. Have a look at it and does much more detailed analysis. A lot of the programs now enable you to video and then annotate the video, so you can look at the biomechanical angles of a performer, or try and break down some of the issues to help show the athlete, not just for the coach, what's going on. So this is Dartfish. Quintic is an incredibly expensive lab-based video analysis and performance analysis software. So you have these little videos in the corner of a biomechanics lab, and you film a performer doing stuff. You'd often put these little markers on them, which is where the joints are, and it constructs like a 3D image of the performer. And along with other data, you can do very, very detailed movement, joint, biomechanical analysis. Not typically available in clubs, generally at elite performance centres or universities. So we've got a continuum of availability, simplicity to complexity. And looking even at these graphs, you would need to have an in-depth knowledge to be able to translate what they mean and make sense of it in order to improve the coaching performance, or to coach the athlete to perform better. It could be that you link the use of something like this with performers with other supporting professionals, the second half of this part, and you might work with a biomechanist who does know what all this means, and the coach and the biomechanist can work together to ultimately figure out how to best coach the performer to improve. So that might be a really nice example, or the sort of thing that you can use. So here's a starting point for you that you can and should add to and translate and make your own, just representing what sort of video software analysis is available, what it's used for, and then some pros and cons of them. Again, I'm not going to read through them. I suggest you pause the video, have a look yourself, make sense of them. The next bit of supporting technology is electronic training logs. So the sorts of places where you can go on your run or go on your cycle or go rowing, and it monitors where you go, how far you go. It might give you some statistical data, the elevation, how high, and the hills that you covered, your pace, your peak speed, your slowest bit. This Strava and Map My Run are very common examples of that sort of generally outdoor, but not only outdoor. So Strava can also collect data from static exercise as well, or other versions of exercise. And then you've got things like MyFitnessPal, which is very much about logging your physical activity sessions, but also includes things like nutrition. So it is a broader, all-inclusive training log and lifestyle exercise log for you. So I suggest you look into those and any others that you know of. And again, here's a supporting page, or sort of summary page, giving you what sorts of things are available as examples, what they might be used for, and then of course some starting point for the pros and cons. Again, this is not exhaustive. You can and should be adding to these things with your own thoughts. You've probably all at some point either had a heart rate monitor on through school maybe, or your club, or maybe you even have a smart device that you wear that gives you heart rate data. Now, a lot of training intensity is determined or targeted relating to heart rate, and therefore it can be really valuable in terms of performance, how hard you're working, but also in terms of a day-to-day lifestyle health focus. If you've got a relatively low resting heart rate, then that's an indication that maybe your cardiovascular health is pretty good. Have a look through these heart rate monitors. It could be that your coach says, right, I want you to perform this lap of the track, or this mile or this 2 mile episode, and keep your heart rate between this and that percentage of your max heart rates. So heart rate is used to not only to monitor how hard you're finding something, but to try and work at that particular heart rate intensity for training and adaptation benefits. Next one then, GPS tracking. So some sports teams will wear these, certainly elite players do. And again, do a little bit of research into this. I know that the women's football team at BTEC use a version of these, and it captures all sorts of performance data whilst you're on the pitch. This sort of stuff here, you can see this sort of heat zoning, indicates where the athlete has been. The redder the colour, the more frequently they've been in that area. The cooler the colour, the bluer the colour, the less often they've been there. So it indicates perhaps the typical players or runs that players might make on a pitch. It might also capture things like speed, top speed, average distance that they've covered in the whole performance, plus I'm sure a lot of other data. So please do a little bit of research into that, check out what you think, and here's the starting point of a table of information, possibly getting you to think about the pros and cons of this kind of data. So power meters are quite specialist cycling equipment, and they give relevant data for cyclists on power generated whilst pedalling. Obviously you can see from the images it can be used on outdoor bikes or static bikes. I'd say, as I said, it was quite specialised, and it can give you things like average or peak power outputs or reduction in power. It indicates perhaps when somebody is fatiguing because they're not generating as much power. So again, very specialised, not particularly transferable to lots of different sports. Generally a professional kind of use, and is quite needs professional fitting, so it's not something you'd necessarily go and buy at the shop and then fit yourself. Then we have things like lab-based testing. Now this can be incredibly useful, and a lot of athletes, certainly at elite level, will have lab-based testing. So you get field-based testing, things like the multi-stage fitness test, or doing a 30-meter sprint outside is a field test, or doing a Illinois agility run is a field test. This tends to be more valid and reliable testing with much more controlled conditions. So tests like this gas analysis test, athletes might be on the treadmill or a static bike. I have seen images of somebody doing this test in a pool with somebody walking alongside them. It basically measures your VO2 max, which is what bleep test, a multi-stage fitness test, measures. But this is the gold standard way of actually measuring how much oxygen your body is able to use per minute. So high quality data, scientific data, gives you lots of other data as well, but perhaps isn't the sort of thing you'd have at a club. It's more at a university or elite performance centre, and needs a sports scientist really to run the test. Lactate measurement. Now actually you can buy these. We have got some at the Lactate Pro in college. It's not particularly hard to administer, and you just have to have a little bit of physiological understanding to know what the numbers mean. And it's basically how much lactate have you produced, lactic acid have you produced doing a particular activity. And this can be done, in between events at the pitch side. It doesn't need to be necessarily in a lab, but can be done alongside other tests in a lab. A Wingate test is an example of where you would definitely take measurements before and after, a really powerful cycling test. So have a little look at some of the details I've started you off with in terms of testing that's done in a physiology or biomechanics lab. I think this is the last one, online resources. So obviously the internet is a wealth of knowledge, and it provides access to all sorts of information. You can look on Wikipedia, which actually is not a very credible source of information because anybody can write on it, and find out some quite interesting accessible information. There might be Facebook groups that are made specific to a sport, and coaches might access that, or YouTube channels where people post things about training or technique or skills. The downsides of things like that is that how do you know how high quality or credible those people are that are making those videos or posting those things on Facebook? Maybe you can't be sure. You've got things like BBC Sport, which again gives you it's probably more information about what's going on rather than necessarily coaching information. So that may be more limited. You've got your national governing body sources of information, so you can go onto their websites, and they quite often post training advice or drills and associated information for coaches. And then you've got your specialist magazine, which can definitely give you nutritional training, performance technique advice. And probably the most credible is a sports science journal, because these are often peer reviewed. And what that means is specialists in sports science have checked the articles, what people have put in there or proposed to put in these journals, and they've verified that they are good quality and truthful and relevant information, not just any old Tom, Dick and Harry putting something together and posting it on YouTube. So there's quite a range from specialist sources to scientific sources to national governing body sport sources to the media to anybody. Obviously, there are some pros and cons to all of those, and there's a starting point for you to have a think about those. So the second half of this section is about supporting professionals, so other professionals alongside the coach who can work to support performance and development and the athletes that are trying to improve. Pause the video, have a little read of these. These are kind of prompts for the sorts of things you might think about when you're analysing the effectiveness and the value and the use of these supporting professionals. The spec lists all of these, and some of them I think are easier to write about than others. I suggest you have a look at a range of them and maybe pick some that are quite contrasting. So I wouldn't recommend you pick the chiropractor and the osteopath because they're both quite similar. So pick some that are quite varied and a bit different from each other, but make sure you pick ones and that you know how to relate to and explain how they are effective in supporting coaches and athletes that are being coached. So again, your spec actually specifies these criteria that they want you to think about and they want you to analyze when you're looking at the physiologist or the nutritionist. How are they going to be effective and support coaches and support performers? What's the cost? Is it practical that these are likely to be available or used by the coaches or used by the athletes? What relevance do they have to the coaches and athletes? How can they help them? So some of these are a bit odd to try and think about, but this is the language of the spec, and therefore this is perhaps the sort of language you need to include when you're doing your analysis. Let's look at them then. Again, I would recommend consider your planning in tabular form. So these are the sorts of criteria it suggests you think about, and you want to know, is this professional going to be positive or less effective or limiting value based on some of those factors. Nutritionist. So nutritionists obviously are to do with educating and guiding performers in terms of enhancing their general health, but also their sport and their performance. It might be trying to encourage them or coach them or ensure that they have positive eating habits. It might be that they design specific nutritional plans for them. It may be they just give them advice. It may be they actually provide supplements to go alongside their performance based on their training load and competition status. So you've probably heard of nutritionists. You've probably got a common sense perspective of what they do. You need to do some detailed research, but here are some starting points for you. Have a little look at those. Osteopath. So as I said, osteopath and chiropractor are similar. Osteopaths are there to assess and hopefully treat any injuries and conditions, making sure that you have good range of movement. They might treat soft tissue as well. So I think both chiropractors and osteopaths blend and overlap quite a lot in what they do. It's not just, bone crunching, making those noises, which actually is gas being released from the joints. It's about figuring out structural mechanical issues and trying to address any muscular imbalances or joint issues to help you. Have a little look at the summary page there. This again, I do stress repeatedly, this is not exhaustive. This is just a starting point. You need to do some in-depth research yourself if you're going to choose to use osteopath. Chiropractor, again, similarly, identifies and treats neuromuscular disorders, focusing on treatment through physical adjustments and or manipulation of the spine. So, broadly speaking, I always thought a chiropractor was much more focused around the vertebral column. And my understanding of the osteopath was it wasn't just the vertebral column, it was other joints as well. I don't think it's solely that, but that was my sort of, for many years, that's what I've associated. But of course, please do your own research, and of course, have a look at this starting point for you. Moving on, physiotherapist. Many of you, I'm sure, will have been treated by a physiotherapist. You could also have been treated by a sports therapist. They are different. Sports therapists are purely trained in musculoskeletal treatment and, sport specifically, whereas physiotherapists train for all sorts of clinical fields, neurological, respiratory, and then after they've completed their training, will maybe, if they want to be a sports physio, have to then focus in on the sports aspect. Their training, their degree is not about sport at all. So physios are perhaps more broadly, perhaps more highly qualified than a sports therapist, but a sports therapist might be more specialist straight away. Here's a starting point for your thoughts on analysis of the use of and the role of a physiotherapist alongside coaches with performers. Sports massage therapist. So this again is really about the manipulation and treatment of soft tissue, muscles, tendons, ligaments. And the idea being either it's maintenance, so they're trying to treat you regularly to avoid injury and discomfort and pain, or to treat you pre-event, before a performance, to get you ready to perform optimally, maybe increase your range of movement, or to treat you afterwards in recovery from training or performance. So sports massage therapist, huge role to go alongside sports performers within a club, certainly. Have a little look at your summary slide. Sports psychologist. Now, this is different again. Obviously, most of those professionals we've talked about so far are associated with physical treatments and physical support. This is obviously mental, cognitive, psychological support. These, I would say, are really valuable. Psychology is underrated in coaching. Most coaches are pretty good at the skills, pretty good at tactical coaching, possibly good at fitness coaching, may not be trained or educated in psychology. Unfortunately, psychology is massive in sport. You can be a brilliantly skillful player, and if your psychology falls apart, so do you. So sports psychologists have a huge role in trying to manage players' psychology to make it optimal for enhancing performance. Have a little look at the role of sports psychologists to support coaches and performers in the summary table. Strength and conditioning coach. So this is kind of your physical trainer, literally as it says, will direct performers in what to do in terms of developing and building strength and to condition their bodies specifically for the performances that are required of them. So these are pretty common in clubs, but especially at elite level, to improve the physical condition of performers. And they are and they should be sport specific. So this isn't like going to the gym. This is an S&C coach working with a rugby team to make sure that the team are robust and physically prepared for playing matches and training in the way that rugby is performed. Have a little look there. Lastly then, there's just a very simple overview summary of some of the professionals you might choose from, and you need to choose a range, as I said, of contrasting professionals. So just to finish, you need to select several, not necessarily all, but several, a range of supporting technologies that you're going to analyze in terms of these specific criteria mentioned down here. And similarly, you're going to select several supporting professionals. I'd say a good 4 done in detail, done well. Again, considering and specifically discussing these criteria down here.